General Giraud, for the umpteenth time, declared that it was all politics, that he did not wish to interfere in it, that he was only interested in the re-establishment of the French army, that he had full confidence in our American allies. "I have just concluded an agreement with President Roosevelt," he said, "by which the United States undertakes to equip as many military formations as I can form. I expect to have about 12 divisions in 6 months. And you, in the same period of time, will you have even half of them, and who will give you arms?" "There is no question here of competition between us as to armed forces," I objected. "The troops that are in North Africa at the moment belong to France. They are not your property, and if we do not agree with you, you will feel it very soon. The main thing is the unity of the French in the metropolis and overseas, which will require the establishment of a central authority adequate to the task. It will then be possible to unite the disparate forces without difficulty, using them for the good of the fatherland. The events themselves led to the fact that fighting France became a symbol of resistance to the enemy, support for the Republic, national renewal. It is quite natural that it is to her that the feelings of all turn at the moment when the illusions about Vichy are dispelled. On the other hand, many people have the greatest respect for you as a military leader. I myself value you in this respect as a part of the French patrimony, the loss of which I would bitterly regret. A sensible solution, therefore, is this. Let de Gaulle form a wartime government in Algeria, which at the right moment will become the government of the Republic. Let Giraud be given by that government the post of commander of the Liberation Army. At the worst, if some form of transition is necessary, let us form together a central government. But let it condemn Vichy from its first steps. Declare the armistice null and void, link its destiny with the Republic, and serve in the eyes of the world as the personification of French independence. General Giraud still stood his ground, but seeing that he acted more from obstinacy than from conviction, I hoped that one day the very course of events would force him to change his mind. In the meantime, matters of national interest demanded concerted action. We were talking of military operations, of finance, of communication and exchange, of currency, of the fate of Tunisia, of the fate of Indochina, of the annexation of the Antilles, of Guyana, of the fleet at Alexandria, and we decided to establish communication between us. I told General Giraud that I intended to send a mission to North Africa under General Catroux, to which he immediately agreed. I then invited Giraud and his companions to breakfast, Catroux, D'Argentliou, Palevsky, Boilembert, as well as Linares, Bulfray, and Poniatowski, who had time to receive information from the outside, learned without surprise, but not without bitterness, that the agreement had not taken place. Breakfast did not go cheerfully. Then Robert Murphy came to visit me. He believed, or pretended to believe, that everything would be settled in accordance with the project of which he was the author. When I pointed out my doubts to him and asked him what he thought the reaction of Moroccan and Algerian public opinion would be when it became known that the Anfer agreement had failed, he told me that many would be satisfied and breathe a sigh of relief. In North Africa, he added, there are not more than 10 Gaullists for every 100 people. He informed me that President Roosevelt and Churchill had just concluded an agreement with General Giraud concerning the supply of arms and food for North Africa, which I approved without reservation. On the other hand, it was a form of recognition of the civilian and military commander-in-chief, which had never before been formulated in the United States and approved by Great Britain. In the interest of the French people, the agreement specified, and in order to safeguard the past, present and future of France, the President of the United States and the British Prime Minister recognized to the French Commander-in-Chief, whose headquarters are in Algiers, the right and duty to act as representative of French interests, military, economic and financial, connected now or in the future with the liberation movement which has begun in North Africa and French West Africa. They undertake to assist him in the fulfillment of his task by all means at their disposal. Thus America and England, acting as deciders of the destiny of the French people, agreed with the Giraud alone, who, on the pretext that he was not engaged in politics, agreed to recognize their authority. I knew that the day before Churchill, talking with Giraud, handwritten on the corner of the table that the pound sterling in North Africa will be worth 250 French francs. Under the agreement we had made in London, the pound was worth only 176 francs. I also learned that President Roosevelt had invited the Sultan of Morocco to dinner and had not spoken to him quite as he was supposed to speak, given the French protectorate, and Giraud had not interrupted that. In the evening, Harold Macmillan, made me listen to a tirade on the subject of anxiety about the future of battling France. At last, General Wilbur announced that the conference would be over within 24 hours and handed me a message which the French officers on duty at Casablanca were requested to convey. I instructed him to convey to his leaders how surprised I was at the circumstance that in the midst of the fighting for North Africa, in which the French army, including also the French Free Forces, was taking a very active part, none of the Allied military authorities who had come to the conference at Anfer had deemed it necessary to exchange a word with me either of their plans or of the progress of operations. Early next day, early in the morning, Macmillan and Murphy handed me the message drafted during the night by Roosevelt and Churchill and passed on their request to Generals de Gaulle and Girard to publish it jointly in their own names. Girard had already accepted their offer. According to the Anglo-American text, which thus became the French text, the two generals were announcing that they were in agreement with the principles of the United Nations and making known to all their intention to form together a committee to administer the French overseas possessions during the war. No doubt the formula was vague and could not commit us to too much. It came from the Allies. It made it clear that I was renouncing anything beyond the administration of the overseas possessions, and finally, it made it appear that agreement had been reached when it had not, after questioning my 4 colleagues, all of whom were unanimously opposed. I replied to the envoys that the creation of a national authority for France would never be the result of foreign interference, however friendly it might be and from whomsoever it might come. I nevertheless agreed to meet again with the President and Prime Minister before the close of the conference, scheduled for the afternoon. Our conversation with Churchill was conducted in extremely sharp tones. Perhaps in the whole war we had never had such a draughty meeting. During the stormy scene, the Prime Minister showered me with bitter reproaches, but it was clear to me that they were only a screen to cover his own confusion. He told me that on his return to London, he would publicly accuse me of having frustrated the agreement, would raise against me the public opinion of England, and would appeal to the public opinion of France. I confined myself to remarking that I had the friendliest feelings for him personally, and that, while appreciating the alliance with England, I could only regret his present position, wishing to meet America at all costs. He supports an unacceptable thing for France, which in addition is fraught with anxiety for the rest of Europe and is not in the interests of England itself. I then went to Roosevelt. Here I was given a more skillful reception. In other words, I was greeted with friendliness, but with evident sorrow. The President told me that he was sorry to see that no agreement had been reached among the French, and that he had not been able to get me to accept even the text of the communique. In human affairs, he said, the public must be presented with dramatic situations. The news of your meeting with General Girard at a conference at which I, as well as Churchill, are present. If this news were moreover accompanied by a joint declaration by the French leaders, even if it were only a matter of purely theoretical agreement, would produce the desired dramatic effect. Be calm, I objected. The communique will appear, though it will not be yours. Following this, I introduced my staff to the President. He named his own to me. Just then Churchill and General Girard entered, both with an entourage, a whole group of Allied military commanders and officials. While the entrants crowded around the President, Churchill loudly repeated his filibuster against me, and all his threats with the evident intention of at least partially flattering Roosevelt's wounded ego. Roosevelt, however, pretended not to notice anything, spoke to me in a very gracious tone for contrast, and asked me to fulfill his last request, to which he attached great importance. Will you not, he said to me, at least agree to be photographed next to me and the British Prime Minister, and together with General Girard? Willingly, I replied, for I have the greatest respect for that great soldier. And will you go to the extent, cried the President, of shaking hands with General Girard in our presence and before the lens of the camera? My answer was, I shall do that for you. Roosevelt was then delighted and ordered himself to be led out into the garden, where 4 chairs had been placed in advance. We saw countless cameras pointed in our direction and a host of reporters lined up in several rows with pens at the ready. The 4 of actors smiled sweetly. A befuddled handshake was demonstrated. Things were shaping up just right. America would be satisfied to see in the picture that the French question had been resolved by a deus ex machina in the person of the President himself. Before leaving Anfer, I drew up a brief communique and invited Girard to sign it, unless, of course, I brought it to the attention of the Allies. We saw each other. We conversed, we reaffirmed our faith in the victory of France, in the triumph of the liberties of man. We declared that a permanent mutual bond had been established between us. Giraud signed. At his request, the words democratic principles, first included by me, were replaced in the text by the words human freedoms. The weeks that followed were agonizing for me. After Anfa, I had hoped to go to Libya, where our troops were fighting. But the Allies resisted, citing technical difficulties. They gave us the only way to leave the confines of Anfa, on an English airplane going directly to London. We returned to London on January 26. At a press conference on February 9, I described what had really happened in Anfa, which was not in any way consistent with the information circulated by Anglo-American sources. I revealed without ceremony the back thoughts of official and officious American persons who had reproached the fighting French for their desire to get involved in politics and had hoped thereby to prevent France from having any politics at all. So when I again declared my intention of visiting the East, the British government in March let me know, this time in writing, that it refused to provide me with the technical means to do so. The contest between Washington and London in unfavourability to us was more than amply reflected in the press and broadcasting, with few and noble exceptions. Newspapers and commentators in America, and even in Britain itself, seemed to have no doubt that French unity was to take place around the Girard. In almost all newspapers and radio appearances, the harshest judgments were made against. Some said pathetic hubris or unfulfilled pretensions, but the majority declared that I was a candidate for dictator, that my entourage, swarming with fascists and cagouillards, was pushing me to establish personal absolute power in France after liberation. That in contrast to me, General Giraud, a simple soldier without any political pretensions or intentions, was a pillar of democracy, that the French people could trust Roosevelt and Churchill to prevent me from enslaving the French. It goes without saying that some French émigrés who did not join me, and for this very reason depended on foreigners, disseminated and endeavoured to inculcate these theses in every possible way. In America, the newspaper Pour la Victoire; in England, the daily newspaper France; the telegraphic agency Agence Française Indépendante; the magazine La France Libre, and a large part of the collective The French Tell the French, broadcast through the BBC, openly sided with Giraud. But Gaullist organs such as Henry Thores's Voix de la France in New York, Francois Killis's La Marseillaise in London, Maurice Schumann's broadcast on English radio, and the large radio station of Fighting France in Brazzaville supported our position. It must be said that while the Allies gave us trouble in French Africa, they were continually multiplying examples of friendly attitudes towards us. The combat movement, which united the Gaullists, was constantly replenished by their supporters. René Capetin came to London to inform me of this. Those parts of Leclerc who came into contact with the Saharan troops at Gardames met with an enthusiastic reception, and many declared their desire to join the army. In Nigeria, in Dahomey, in Togo, in Guinea, in the Ivory Coast, in Upper Volta, our emissaries were now making contacts. But the popular choice was particularly evident among the sailors. Most of the crews of military and commercial vessels which were sailing from Morocco, from West Africa, from Algeria, through American and British ports, took advantage of this opportunity to report to the recruiting stations of Fighting France. Thus, the Richelieu, bound from Dakar to New York for repairs, was abandoned by 300 sailors who wished to serve in the Free French Navy. Squadron Destroyer Fantasque, transport ship Wyoming cargo ship lot, going to America, also lost many sailors. In the Scottish port of Greenock, the crews of the transport ships Eridan, Ville d'Oran, Champollion, Croix, Meon joined General de Gaulle and demanded that the Lorraine Cross be hoisted on the masts. All this irritated Washington, especially since by a number of signs could be foreseen that when the German and Italian armies, while still separating the troops of Giraud from the troops of Leclerc and Lamin, will be locked in Tunisia, the military units of North Africa unstoppable flow into the ranks of the Free French. The Americans, fearing that the conclusion of the African battle would lead to a multiplication of the ranks of the Gaullists, tried in every way to get us to agree to a compromise. They tried to resort to a policy of firmness. In the United States, some of the sailors who had left the stanch ship to join Fighting France were arrested and imprisoned. Our delegate in Tixia and Admiral Gayral, the head of our naval mission, were threatened by the State Department and the Maritime Ministry. In Great Britain, the British themselves have so far limited themselves to mournful mien, but the Americans threatened all punishments to the crews of French ships that came from Africa to receive my orders. It came to the point that the vessel Jamaica, which had anchored in the port of Greenock, was occupied by a detachment of American sailors. At Carlton Gardens, Admiral Stark. In despair at having to go against a cause he sympathized with in mind and heart, but bound by orders, complained many times to Marine Commissioner Obuano, to Dythelm, in whose charge was the merchant marine, and on occasion to me. The American press and radio disseminated official and officious statements accusing General de Gaulle of sabotaging the war effort and preventing the French Navy from carrying out its direct task. I did give an unequivocal order to accept volunteers, believing that their determination should be welcomed while Algeria was acting apart from us, and believing also that it was in the interest of the cause to use sailors wherever they wished to serve, and that this was far more sensible than pushing them away, and thereby creating a deafening resentment. Moreover, this demonstration was to attract the attention of world public opinion. At the same time, I instructed Algeria, through Admiral Fenard, the head of the Algerian naval mission in America, to replace the sailors who had dropped out. There were enough personnel in North Africa, as a large number of ships were sunk in battles with the Allies. As for the merchant ships, I decided to personally give them orders to return under the Cross of Lorraine to their anchorage in Algerian or Moroccan ports, after their accession to us was recorded. Receiving Admiral Stark on March 11, I informed him of these orders, which were already being carried into effect. The United States, however, applied to us the carrot and stick policy. On February 22, Sumner Welles wrote Tixia that Roosevelt, for the umpteenth time, expresses his desire for me to come to Washington for a visit. I secure me umpteenth time, replied that I was ready to go there, and re for the umpteenth time. There was no more specific invitation. One has to think that these plans, which appeared instantly and were just as quickly buried, played the same distracting and magical role in White House politics as the sea serpent. But the tumult raised abroad did not turn us from our intention of appealing to the national feeling of the French. We had no doubt of it from the very day when the enemy, having occupied the whole of France, had completely subjugated Vichy, wanting to finally untie his hands. Laval, on his return from the Führer's headquarters on November 17, received from Pétain the authority to solely issue any legislative acts and decrees. During the winter, the persecution of the Jews intensified, despite public outrage and the protests of the clergy, notably the Bishop of Toulouse, Monsignor Salierge and Cardinal Gerlier of Lyon, and the condemnation of these actions by Pastor Begner, president of the Federation of French Protestants. On January 30, 1943, the Pétain militia was created, headed by Darien, who had already allied himself with the German police and now, as the newly appointed Secretary-General, began to persecute patriots. On February 16, a forced labour service was established, giving the government the ability to supply the enemy with unlimited quantities of labour it required. On April 29, Hitler, again receiving Laval, agreed with him on additional points of cooperation. If part of the population out of desperation or out of pity still tolerated the Marshal, all Frenchmen, except for a few obsessives, condemned the policy pursued in his name. The chief school of the nation was now the resistance, and it was merging with fighting France. Traffic back and forth between the metropolis and London did not cease. Into our office in Carlton Gardens, into the house in Duke Street where the Bizet worked, into many unremarkable houses in the city itself and its suburbs, slipped unrecognized those whom our men were taking out of France, or were about to take out of France, by airplane, patrol boats and fishing boats. During the first 4 months of 1943, as the African crisis reached its climax, our air and sea operations service transported several hundred emissaries and delegates, as enriched with many new faces, and among them were René Massigli, whom I appointed National Commissioner for Foreign Affairs on February 5, Army General Bayonet, whom we projected as head of our military mission in Washington, General de Lavalade, soon to be appointed Supreme Commander of the troops in the Middle East, General Vautrin, sent to Libya as Chief of Staff of the Lamin Group, Jules Mock, who immediately joined the Navy, Fernand Grenier, who was brought to us by Remy at the request of the Communists. Under Soustille's control he carried on propaganda, strictly adhering to the Gaullist line, the clever, subtle Pierre Vianneau, whom I was going to make French ambassador to England when the French National Committee crossed to Algeria, and who died in office. André Moresley, who headed our prisoner of war relief organization, which sent more than 1 million parcels a month. Georges Bisson and Markel Poinbeuf, delegates, the former of the General Confederation of Labour, the latter of the Christian Trade Union, both of them, together with Albert Guiguay, their predecessor, and Henry Ock. My associate from the first days, actively represented the trade union movement. Among the prominent parliamentary figures were Gouin, Cailly, Fargen, Guimans, and soon Jacquinot, Oriol, Letroque, Louis Marine, who immediately after the landing hastened to announce to the press, radio, political leaders, diplomats, and allied journalists what Jeannette Heriot, Blum, Mandel, Paul Boncourt, and others had said in their addresses, namely, that only one government was conceivable in the hour of liberation, the government of General de Gaulle. In France itself, as the persecution intensified and their activities intensified, the resistance fighters drew closer together. In addition, the occupation of the zone called free eliminated some of their differences and encouraged them to concentrate their forces. At the end of 1942, I was able to establish personal acquaintance with the leaders of the various organizations of the resistance movement. I also met other people who appeared suddenly, as if emerging from a fog of feverish activity, where everything was there. Cunning operations, fear, arms catches, military raids, printing presses, and much more. These people appeared and just as suddenly returned. Before me passed such men as Cavalies, who, philosopher by nature, was inclined to caution, but, carried away by hatred of oppression, dared the most daring deeds and went to torture and death for France. Daniel Meyer, a methodical champion of socialist action. Jean-Pierre Lévy, modest and resolute. Sayan, a talented trade unionist sent by Leon Jute. Many, and among them Pinault and Semoy Simon, visited me more than once. At the same time, our own delegates were travelling around France. Thus Remy, a remarkable propagandist and a sober organizer, engaged in secret activities like a fascinating but calculated sporting game, was active chiefly in Paris and the West. Benjain in the south. Manuel was on the ground checking our network and our communication service. In January, Brossolette, and a month later, Passy de Vavren also sneaked into France. One young English officer, Thomas, accompanied the head of the BSA at our invitation to deliver information directly from the field to the London government. Working together, Passy and Brossolette were to establish links with the various organizations to induce the North to adopt the same skillful coordination of action at home as it had in the South, to prepare the way for the unification of the resistance of the South and the North by the establishment of a common council and a unified military system. In February, Jean Moulins, my representative in the metropolis and General de Lestrand, commander of the secret army, arrived. The first of these arrivals made a strong impression by his conviction and authority. He was aware that his days were numbered, but was determined to accomplish his task of unification before he passed away. The other had a mission for which he was in no way prepared by his former activities, but he acted with the firmness of a soldier who would not retreat from anything when duty required him to do so. To Molin, who had been preparing the ground for the agreement for a long time, I instructed him to immediately form a French National Council of Resistance, where representatives of all the organizations of the resistance movement in both zones, of all the political parties and of the two main trade union centers would sit. My directive to our representative defined the role of the council, established the basis of agreement, and specified the kind of relationship that would bind him to the National Committee. Jean Moulin was to be chairman of the newly created organization. I appointed him a member of the French National Committee and presented him with the award of the Cross of Liberation at my home in Hempstead in a highly moving ceremony. De Lestrand, during his stay in London, worked usefully with the Allied leaders, notably General Brooke, General Esme Admiral Stark, who recognized in him an equal. We could thus hope that the action of the secret army at the time of the landing in France would, as far as possible, be closely connected with the plans of the command. The instructions received by General de Lestrand from me personally determined his functions. Before the great battle began, he was to perform the duties of Inspector General. When necessary, he was to become commander of the army, namely, from the time when it would be necessary to combine operations at home with operations abroad. But not a month after de Lestrand's return to France, this man of duty and honour was arrested by his enemies, exiled, and soon treacherously murdered at the entrance to the dreaded Nazi camp. He had given his life to his fatherland. Molin and de Lestrade left on March 24 to fight and to die. All these numerous evidences of the successful unification of France contributed in no small measure to the cause of the unification of our whole empire. The National Committee at once entered into negotiations with Algeria on its own initiative. A week after our return from Unfell, General Cattray went to North Africa. There he met a dozen people and succeeded in impressing upon them that our object was agreement, that the undesirable persons whose removal we demanded could, in fact, be counted on the fingers. Whereupon he returned temporarily to Beirut, while Markel, Charbonnier, Peshkov, Pilibon, and others organized our liaison mission in Algiers. Soon afterward, General Busquet, representing General Giraud to me, visited me in London. An exchange of views began. On February 23, the French National Committee worked out the text of a memorandum addressed to the civil and military commander-in-chief and specifying the terms of unification. We propose to consider the armistice of 1940 null and void, to recognize as politically and morally impossible the continued existence of certain persons in leadership positions, to restore republican legality in North Africa. Then, if these provisions are accepted by the Giraud organization, to form a central authority with all the powers of government, so that France, in the conduct of the war, has a single responsible authority and a single representation. To create, in addition, a consultative assembly of the resistance, designed to express as widely as possible the interests of the French people. Thus our position was again formulated. The memorandum was handed to General Giraud on February 26 and published on March 12. It was henceforth impossible for the Algerian system to adhere openly to any other attitude. For regardless of what was happening in France, in Africa events themselves were developing at an accelerating rate in a direction favourable to us. The masses were now dominated by the spontaneous conviction that de Gaulle had won, because Vichy had lost. The artificial nature of the powers of the civilian and military commander-in-chief and his current dependence on the Americans created a difficult atmosphere. In addition, under pressure from Anglo-American missions, pushed by journalists and parliamentarians from their countries, political censorship was relaxed. Many people's eyes were opened. The news from France, the stories of those who had been driven to North Africa by the occupation of the former Free Zone or by the desire to fight for the liberation of their homeland, the fierce fighting in Tunisia, all of this finally dispelled the anti-Gollywood nonsense that had long been peddled by the local authorities. Someone in General Giraud's entourage had enough political sense to try to channel these sympathies. Jean Monnet became the inspiration for this evolution. He left Washington for Algeria in February and brought his economic and administrative talents, as well as his American connections, to Giraud. A memorandum from the National Committee led him to think that it was necessary to hastily embellish the image of a civilian and military commander-in-chief. On this point, Monnet was quickly able to come to an agreement with Mariai, thanks to the latter's dexterity, and with Macmillan, thanks to his shrewd mind. So the month of March witnessed the democratic speeches of the Giraud. On March 4, the new statute of the Legion of Combatants was promulgated in Algiers. On March 5, Giraud announced on the radio, France has no racist prejudices. On March 8, by his order, the issue of the Journal Officiel d'Afrique du Nord, published the day before, which, like the previous ones, had published Marshal Petain's decrees broadcast over the radio, was withdrawn from circulation. On March 14, at a meeting of the Alsaces and Lorrainians, Giraud made a speech denouncing Vichy and glorifying the Republic. On March 15, he wrote to General Cather, I felt it necessary to set forth publicly yesterday the principles which govern my actions. In this, no ambiguity remains between us. I am ready to receive General de Gaulle to determine the concrete form of unification. I ask you to inform him of this. On March 18, he signed a series of orders repealing Vichy legislation in many areas. The next day, Churchill and Cordell Hall, who at one time seemed not even to have noticed the memorandum of the French National Committee, announced that their governments fully endorsed General Giraud's principles. On March 19, General Nogues, and on March 21, Governor-General Boyson announced their full agreement with the Republican actions and speeches of the civil and military commander-in-chief. Following this, General Bergerie, Rigaud, and Lemigre Dubroux resigned and vacated their posts. As all these events unfolded and all these gestures were made, Most of the newspapers and commentators in America and England intensified the campaign of praise and began to hurry Fighting France to join Gérard, against whom, as they believed, the could no longer raise any serious objections. However, in an effort to profit as much as possible from General Gérard's speech of March 14, and from the message which General Catroux had handed me at his request, the French National Committee announced that the statements made in Algiers in many respects signify an approximation to the concept of a fighting France as it was adopted in June 1940 and then reiterated in the Memorandum of February 23. I personally brought it to the attention of General Gérard that I received the message with pleasure and expect to arrive in North Africa shortly. I announced this news by radio, speaking of the National Association in such terms and in such tones that my listeners could be convinced that the French Association had not betrayed its leader and that he had not betrayed his principles. I telegraphed to General Eisenhower that I would be glad to see him on my arrival in Algiers, to which he replied that he would also be very glad. I asked the British government to provide me with but at the same time I declared in public that I was holding fast to my position, which was quite well known to all, and that I would not set out until the French National Committee had received from Algiers a satisfactory reply to the Memorandum of February 20. Then, due to humble US, the most drastic measures were taken. Macmillan opened fire. On March 17, in Algiers, in the absence of General Catroux, he invited Guy de Charbonnieres to join him. Now, he said, when the civil and military commander-in-chief has publicly subscribed to the principles proclaimed by the Fighting France, there is nothing to prevent uniting around General Gérard. As Charbonnier began to object, the English minister burst into a furious outburst of anger. If General de Gaulle, he shouted, even now refuses the hand extended to him, know that America and England will refuse him and he will become nothing. Although Macmillan showed great restraint during further conversation, his démarche was a direct attack. The next attack was led by Archbishop Spellman of New York. He arrived in Algeria and wanted to see me, making it clear that he was carrying out an assignment from the President of the United States. On March 23, I met with the Archbishop Ambassador. This prelate, filled with the most exalted piety, approached the problems of this world with an emphasized desire to serve the cause of God. But no matter how pious a man is, that is why the Archbishop of New York instructed me in wisdom with great persistence. Liberty, equality, charity was the motto which he thought should govern my course of action. Liberty meant that I was to refrain from making my own conditions regarding the union of Fighting France with General Gérard. It meant that I should join the triumvirate of which I had been told at Anfer. Mercy was to mean forgiveness to the men who held certain offices at Algiers, Rabat, and Dakar. Think only, Monsignor Spellman exhorted me. What a misfortune it would be for you to be denied benefits on the ground that you deny them to others. Do you imagine what it would mean for you to be doomed to remain in England and to be excluded from all action, while meanwhile France is being liberated without you? I replied to the Archbishop that in such a case the liberation of France would not take place at all, since victory would mean for my country that the Anglo-Americans would impose upon it a power pleasing to them in place of that which had prevailed thanks to the Germans. We can be sure in advance that in such a case the French people will not follow those and not the other liberators, but a third from which the Western Allies will not be well. It is best to let the national will take its course. I concluded by telling the Archbishop that this will is already manifesting itself against all obstacles. As an example, I referred to the mood in North Africa, to the behaviour of our sailors, and especially to the news coming from France. On the whole, Monsignor Spellman did not seem to be particularly annoyed. I must even say that, as I later learned, I had won his sympathy as a result of our conversations. Soon Churchill made himself known. On April 2, at his request, I went to see him, accompanied by Massigli. The Prime Minister, who had Sir Alexander Cadogan with him, told me that my coming to Algeria might create serious complications unless an agreement between Giraud and myself was reached before then. By agreement, Churchill meant, of course, full acceptance of all the terms of which I had been formally informed at Anfer. 6 otherwise, he pointed out, my presence in North Africa could have undesirable consequences from the point of view of both public order and military situation. The airplane I asked for is ready, the Prime Minister assured me. But is it not more prudent from every point of view to postpone departure until Eden, who is in the United States, has returned, and until General Catroux, who only a week ago arrived in Algeria, has had time to exert his influence there. I wanted Churchill to open up before the end. And so, after bidding him farewell, I stated publicly that I still insisted on my going to Algeria and would accept no conditions. Then the Prime Minister said that the postponement of the trip asks me General Eisenhower, but I soon managed to find out that General Eisenhower did not ask for anything at all, and Churchill was forced to announce that the démarche was made on his personal initiative and that it was he who objected to my trip. On April 6, I saw Eden, then Wynant, who had returned from Washington. Both painted me in decidedly condensed colours a picture of the discontent in America caused by my obstinacy, to the great disadvantage of France. For contrast, they painted to me the advantages which the favour of the Allies would confer upon France if I would consent to subject fighting France to the Giraud. I would have done it with a light heart, I told them, if Giraud had been at the head of North Africa on June 18, 1940, and had continued the war effort in defiance of the orders of Pétain and Weygand. But certain facts had happened. The French nation has taken them into account. In resisting the Allied pressure, I felt no less pressure from many of my collaborators. Some of them were indeed at the mercy of the anxiety caused by the attitude of Washington and London, by the insulting invectives against themselves, and wishing with all their hearts that unification should take place at all costs. They finally relented. Some of the members of the National Committee no longer concealed it. Even General Catroux himself, who had clashed in Algiers with local figures and with Murphy's and Macmillan's men, suggested to me in his dispatches that I should leave to Giraud the priority of political and military command. Realizing his intentions, I nevertheless did not follow his advice. For behind the trees, today's difficulties, there was also a forest. In other words, there was the French nation. And it was in our disputes that the fate of the nation was decided. The National Committee unanimously recognized this when, on April 10, it was informed of Giraud's reply to the memorandum of February 23. Catroux had brought it from Algiers. No doubt this document seemed to speak of good intentions, but at the same time it suggested that France should have no government until the end of the war, that the power of the commander-in-chief, that is, the power of the Allies, should be virtually unlimited. Indeed, it was again suggested to us that only a Council of Overseas Territories should be formed in Algiers, where Giraud, de Gaulle, the residents, the present governors-general, and commissaries on special assignments would sit. The said council was thus not to have any political capacity. It was to be an administrative and coordinating centre, not a national leadership. As for the Commander-in-Chief, General Giraud, he was to be subordinate to the Allied command and was to be independent of any French authority in his military functions. Moreover, he was given the right, when released and under the pretext of a state of siege, to enforce public order and appoint officials throughout the metropolis. Thus, in the absence of any real central French authority, the main questions would be decided at the discretion of a military commander under the authority of a foreign general. This strange system was to continue until the end of the war. After that, without any consultation with the country, they were going to apply the law of 1872, the so-called Trevenec law, according to which, in the absence of a National Assembly, power would be transferred to the general councils in the administrative field, and they would be given the right to appoint the government. In short, judging from the memorandum signed by General Giraud, it was as if France as a state did not exist, at least not until the enemy was defeated. This was precisely Roosevelt's thesis. This document ultimately contributed to the unanimity of our London Committee. All its members saw clearly where the true national path lay. On April 15, when the text of the note which General Catroux was to take to Algeria was being drafted, there was remarkable unanimity among all the participants in the meeting. The note was clear and unequivocal. While recognizing all the positive principles contained in General Giraud's statement, the committee again enumerated the conditions necessary for their application in practice. The formation of an effective authority capable of exercising its influence in all the territories liberated, or being liberated, particularly in the metropolis, in commanding all the French military forces without exception. The subordination to this authority of all officers, resident governors, and above all the Commander-in-Chief himself. The removal of the men personally responsible for the Capi in order to establish a governing body. It is necessary, we reminded ourselves, that the chairman and members of the French National Committee should be allowed to travel to North Africa without any conditions being imposed upon them. On the other hand, to put an end to the rumours of our differences spread by the press, all members of the committee must declare officially that they are in solidarity with General de Gaulle. As the France battleground remained unshaken, the Algerian figures strove even more stubbornly to subdue us. The situation in Africa did not allow us to wait any longer. One thought prevailed in all minds, and one inscription was painted on all walls, and in all streets it was heard. Let de Gaulle come. On March 14, when Giraud left the hall where he had announced his new orientation, the crowd gathered in the square met him with shouts of "Long live de Gaulle." No one doubted that the position taken by the local authorities as of late, the changes made in the Vichy legislation, the dissolution of the Legion, the release of political prisoners, the resignation of prominent figures, that all this was in fact the success of the National Committee. The Cross of Lorraine appeared everywhere. The combat movement took precedence. On April 19, the General Councils of Algiers, Oran and Constantine, opening their sessions, saluted me. On April 26, Peyrauten, paying a visit to General Catrus, declared to the latter that in view of my arrival, and for the cause of unity, he was ready to resign his functions as Governor-General of Algiers and wished to serve France as an officer. On May 1, the motorcades that took to the streets for the Labor Day holiday loudly chanted, "We want de Gaulle." The day before, Churchill had a quite satisfying conversation with me. After reading me the latest Macmillan reports, he admitted that I had won the first round. How then to justify the fact that I was dismissed when on Tunisian soil African troops and the forces of Free France fought a common battle, with the same fervour striving for the same goal, and the struggle there was not an easy one. Since the end of February, Rommel appeared on the scene. Delayed with the help of rearguard fighting victorious March Montgomery, then covered in the south fortified line Murat, he rushed from Sfax to Tebessa, expecting to open a passage to Algeria. The American Army Corps and the French Division of Velvet, whose glorious general was soon afterward killed, with difficulty held back this advance. At the same time, General von Arnim, Neering's successor, was attacking, on the one hand, the northern coast in the neighbourhood of Tabarka, which was defended by General Munsaba's volunteer command and Moroccan troops, and on the other hand, Medjaz el Bab held by the British. A serious setback could have been feared. But the Allied forces held on precisely because of the vigorous action of the French units, poorly armed and equipped, and because of the authority of General Juin, who was able to turn the scattered units and scraps of compounds into an effective instrument of struggle. Finally, in the middle of March, when the Eighth Army, with which the units of the fighting France were marching, came into action, the outcome of the battle was predetermined. Indeed, Montgomery's troops approached the Murat line, skirted it, and reached Gabes. This invasion allowed Patton to overrun Gabes. Sfax was in turn liberated on April 11, Sousse and Kairoun on April 12. Then the general Allied offensive began. On May 7, Bradley and Magnan took Bizerte, Anderson entered Tunis, and Celts captured Pont-du-Fez. On May 11, Lamin's division took possession of Tecruna. The next day, General von Arnim, blockaded at Cape Bioun, capitulated with his units, numbering 250,000 men. But as our soldiers, who had come from the Lake Chad region and from the east, came into contact in continuous fighting with their brave comrades from Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, as well as with the population of these territories, a general enthusiasm rose around them. On March 26, Lamina telegraphed me that the centres of southern Tunisia, Medina, Djerba, Zarzis, and others were pressing to join fighting France. On April 6, Leclerc informed me that when he and his men appeared at Gabes, the town was the scene of universal rejoicing. On April 14, the American press reported that when the British and Free French entered Sfax, everyone shouted, "Long live de Gaulle." New York Herald Tribune, in an article entitled, "Where is Our Strength?" Indescribable enthusiasm swept over everyone when the dusty tricolour banner flying on the truck announced the arrival of the soldiers of fighting France. The correspondents themselves, describing the scene, were literally stunned by such a surprise. Knowing with what fervour in France itself people of all parties responded to the call of de Gaulle, seeing the tears of joy in the eyes of people in the liberated cities in Tunisia, the applause and flowers, is it necessary to ask where are the forces that can bring victory to our cause? On April 30, Colonel Vanek, formerly commissary of the youth camps and now commander of the 7th Regiment of African Mounted Rangers, asked permission to move with his regiment under my command. On May 3, at Safax, the 4th Speger Regiment, the whole of it except a few officers, made the same request to General Leclerc. As soon as the fighting was over, a great number of military men belonging to the various African formations simply left their units in the hope of joining the troops fighting under the Cross of Lorraine. On May 20, a detachment of Free Frenchmen rightfully received their share of the victory greetings proclaimed in Tunis on the Allied route. So the judgment of the people finally put an end to all sorts of subterfuges. On April 27, General Girard wrote me that he was giving up the priority. He still insisted, however, on his idea of a council with no real power and in which, besides the two of us, the residents and governors would also sit. On the other hand, fearing, no doubt, the reaction of the mob, Girard suggested that our first meeting should be held at some distant point, either at Biscry or at Mar. In my reply of May 6, I reiterated once more the unchanged position of the French National Committee as to the nature, composition, and functions of the newly organized governmental body, flatly rejected the idea of negotiating its formation in some remote oasis, and pointed to Algiers as the place of our meeting. The previous day, in a public speech, I had said in a rather harsh tone that it was time to put an end to such tendencies. On the night of May 15, Philip and Sostel, radiant with joy, brought me a telegram just received from Paris. Jean Moulin was informing me that a National Council of Resistance had been founded and was sending me the following message on behalf of that council. All the organizations and parties of the resistance of the northern and southern zones, on the eve of General de Gaulle's departure for Algeria, reassure him, as well as the National Committee, of their complete fidelity to the principles they have proclaimed, not a single part of which they will never compromise. All the organizations and parties firmly declare that the intended meeting must take place openly in the residence of the Algerian Governor-General among the French, in full publicity. In addition, they declare problems must not be excluded from the negotiations. The French people will never allow General de Gaulle to be subordinated to General Girard and demand the speedy establishment of an interim government in Algeria under the presidency of General de Gaulle, with General Girard as military leader. General de Gaulle will remain for all the only leader of the French resistance, whatever the outcome of the negotiations. On May 27, the full National Council, chaired by Jean Moulin, met for its first session at No. 48 Rue du Fort and adopted the text of the message sent to me. Thus, in all the territories of France, and above all in her suffering land, the harvest that had been carefully nurtured was ripening at the right hour. The telegram from Paris, sent to Algeria and transmitted by the American and English radio stations, as well as by those of the Free French, had a decisive effect, not only because of its provisions, but above all and most of all because it showed that the French resistance had been able to unite. The voice of France, still muffled by the enemy but already strong and formidable, suddenly overrode the whispers of intrigue and the rantings of the supporters of all sorts of combinations. And I myself became much stronger at once. But Washington and London, without much pleasure, although with full understanding of the significance of the event. May 17, General Girard asked me to immediately arrive in Algeria to form a French central authority. On May 25, I replied to him, I expect to arrive in Algiers at the end of this week. I rejoice that I shall soon cooperate with you in the service of France. Before leaving England, I wrote to King George VI to say how grateful I was to him personally, to his government, to his people for having been received here in the tragic days of 1940, and for the hospitality extended to free France and its head. When I wanted to pay Churchill a visit, it turned out that he had just departed to an unknown destination. I therefore paid my farewell visit to Eden. The conversation took place in a friendly atmosphere. "What is your opinion of us?" asked the English minister. "Your people are the very kindest of people," I replied, "but of your politics I cannot always say the same." As we touched upon the many matters which the English government had discussed with me, Eden said good-naturedly, "Do you know that you have caused us more hardship than all our other European allies?" "How not to know?" I retorted, smiling back at him. France is a great power." At noon on May 30, an airplane of the Fighting France, flown by Marmaya, took me to Boufarik. I was accompanied by Massigli, Philip, Paoski, Billiot, T. Izo, and Charles Ruroux. We were met by General Girard and also by General Catrouet. The representatives of the American and British mission are seated behind the French. The gendarmerie stands in guard of honor. Music is playing La Marseillaise. The cars are French. All this, especially when compared with the reception I received at Anfer, shows that the French Battle of France, and in its person France itself, has now taken a prominent position in North Africa. The public knows nothing of our arrival. The censors of Algiers, London, and New York have forbidden the reporting of this news. That is why the localities through which our cortege passes at high speed do not organize any meetings. Only vigilant Gaullists, who have come here just in case, see us off with applause. In Bir Kadaim, the inhabitants who happen to know of our arrival rush out shouting, "Long live de Gaulle," but the local authorities have already taken all measures to ensure that our entry into Algeria takes place without the people. From Boufarik, where the deserted airfield is located on the outskirts of the city, which made us choose it instead of landing in Mesa Blanche, we drive directly to the Summer Palace, bypassing the city. A sumptuous breakfast awaits us. This good French custom is sacredly observed, whatever the relations and concerns of the fellow traveller. Giraud and I sit opposite each other. To my right sits General Giraud, which I am not surprised at, and tells me how the English took him out of France. On my left sits Jean Monnet, who immediately starts talking about economic matters. Catros and Massagli sit on either side of my visage. André Philippe and René Meyer, Palesky and Couve de Merville 59, Linares and Billiot take part in the conversation, as do 30 other invitees. Here they were gathered, the French, so different from each other and yet so similar. The waves of events have nailed them to different shores, but they have finally found each other, as lively and confident as they were before the drama began. Looking at them, one might even think that nothing tragic has happened in these 3 years. However, there are two teams here. Outwardly, it is not difficult to establish the balance of power. On one side, everything. On the other, nothing. On one, the army, police, administration, finance, press, radio, communications. Everything is totally dependent on the civilian and military commander-in-chief. The allies through whom he came to power place their might at his disposal only. I, on the other hand, have nothing in this country. No troops, no gendarmerie, no officials, no bank account, no way to be heard without help. Yet the behaviour, the words, the looks of everyone I have met in the last 2 hours have already revealed to me which side is outnumbered. Everyone knows in his heart how the argument will end. The crowd shouts the same thing with all its might when, at 4 o'clock, I appear at the Place de la Poste to lay the cross of Lorraine at the foot of the monument to the fallen. Although this demonstration was spontaneous and no newspaper had said a word about it, and no military unit had shown up, thousands of patriots, alerted by the local combat organization, hastily gathered in the plaza and greeted me with deafening cheers. After honouring the memory of all Algerians who have fallen for France, I belt out the Marseillaise, and it is picked up by hundreds of voices. Then, amidst the jubilation, I go to my allotted Villa Glikinia. Messages are already arriving there. The first letter I read was from General Wigeman, former Chief of the General Staff of the Air Force, who after the disaster of 1940 withdrew to his place and lived his pain and his hopes. In the most noble terms, this major military figure asks me to give under his command one of the air squadrons of the fighting France and assign him the appropriate rank. After the cheers of the crowd, Villemin's gesture makes things even clearer to me. Here, as elsewhere, popular feeling has made its choice. So in the game that has begun, the main trump card is in my hands. Among the French in Africa, my only obstacle will be the stubbornness of the officials and the distrust of some of the notables. But I shall have to reckon with the determined opposition of the Allies, who will, of course, support the clan of our political rivals. An agonizing battle. It begins the very next morning. At the Lycée Fromentin, where the future government intends to hold its meetings and house its services, I meet General Giraud. With him are Monnet and Georges, and with me are Catrops, Philippe and Massagli. We are all agreed as to procedure. The 7 present will form a government committee, and, following that, co-opt the other members to make up the government. But I want to secure an advantage for myself while nothing is yet fixed on paper. In order that we may, I say, form a united whole and work in harmony, some essential questions must first be settled. Until such time as our country can express its will, the entire responsibility for the destinies of the state rests upon the shoulders of the government. The commander-in-chief, whether the minister or the chairman performs that function, is appointed by and under the authority of the government. If we decide that such a commander should, for the period of military operations, be subject to the strategic direction of some foreign general, it can only be by order of the French authority. For my part, I shall never agree to replace the French National Committee by any other, unless we first determine that the new body shall enjoy full authority in all spheres, and in particular in the military. On the other hand, in order to show with our own eyes that France has never ceased hostilities and that she entirely rejects Vichy, we must remove General Nogues, Governor-General Boisson, and Governor-General Péroton. Giraud is angry. He does not agree with the army commander being subordinate to the government. As for the proconsuls, he eagerly declares that he will never sacrifice them. I insist on my terms. It is decided to close the meeting and then resume the debate again on the basis of the drafts prepared. During the discussion, Georges alone supports Giraud. Monnet tries to find a compromise solution. Catrops, Philip, and Massigli. All three approve of the position I have taken, though in different degrees. The discussion has begun, but the government is not yet established, and I think of myself as a sailor caught in a violent storm, who firmly believes that if he stays on course, the horizon will sooner or later clear. In the meantime, the squall is getting worse. A storm is brewing, and it seems that everything may finally perish. But in our hearts we feel that the main thing has been determined. On June 1, I gather at the Villa Wisteria all the journalists that are available in Algeria, and here before me is a crowded cohort of people devoured by curiosity. At the head of it are the Allied newspapermen, who do not hide their pleasure. At last a fresh wind has blown, which will bring with it loud headlines and stunning articles. A little behind are the French, wavering between a feeling of sympathy for me and fear of the censorship held by the Information Directorate under the civilian and military commander-in-chief. I make a brief statement to them in which I indicate that, together with my colleagues, I have come to North Africa to form here a truly French power, capable of directing the military efforts of the nation, defending French sovereignty, created in harmony with the resistance movement, and rejecting a bunch of people who symbolize just the opposite. Such language and such a tone are unfamiliar here, and they were immediately spread everywhere. In the evening of the same day, Colonel Jews brings me a letter from Péroton, the Governor-General of Algiers, considering that the sincere union of all Frenchmen is the only means of securing the victory which will enable us to revive our greatness, and prompted by a concern to hasten the hour of its arrival, sends me a letter of resignation and asks my assistance before the military authorities to enable him to serve in the army. Nothing in the text indicates that the same message was also sent to General Giraud. I reply to Péroton that I accept his resignation and that in the face of the terrible trials our fatherland is undergoing, the French will appreciate his unselfish gesture as much as I do. Of this I am sure. I direct that a copy of the Governor-General's letter and a copy of my reply be immediately delivered to General Giraud, and that I bring this event to the attention of the press. The next day the news will appear in the newspapers of the whole world. Péroton's resignation, especially under these circumstances, made a strong impression. It made no difference that he later sent General Giraud a letter composed in the same terms. The fact that the former minister of Vichy, who had come from Brazil, where he had been ambassador, to Africa to enter the Algerian government at Roosevelt's request, resigned his functions and publicly agreed to my demands, indicated that the Algerian system was wearing out. The confusion of the men connected with the system and their advisers in Allied circles had reached a climax. This confusion was heightened by the fact that a real fever was gripping the Sikh. News came from all quarters of a mass of volunteers who were taking trucks and rolling along the roads in the hope of joining the forces of Lamin and Leclerc. A few days before, Giraud, with Eisenhower's approval, had removed parts of the Cross of Lorraine from French territory. They ended up in the vicinity Tripoli, but no matter how distant their camp was, it drew thousands of young soldiers, consumed with anxiety. Giraud entrusted the maintenance of order in the city and vicinity of Admiral Muselier, who was brought by the British and who hoped as prefect of police to take revenge for his former misadventures. So I was not at all surprised to receive on June 2 a letter signed Civil and Military Commander-in-Chief, but from the style of the letter it was not difficult to guess who was its inspirer. In a tone common to London emigrants who had not joined us, I was accused of wishing to drive from office men who were quite trustworthy, to break our alliances, and to establish my own dictatorship, as well as that of the Cagouliards who supposedly constituted my entourage. While the meaning of this letter was reaching my consciousness, I was informed that soldiers were being kept at the ready in the barracks, that armoured cars were piling up outside the summer palace, that meetings and processions were forbidden throughout Algiers, that troops and gendarmerie had occupied all the entrances and exits of the city and the nearest airfields. Sitting at my villa Glycinia, under the protection of 10 pages sent to me by Lamine, I had the opportunity of ascertaining that all this turmoil had no effect on the persons who had hastened to accept my invitation and to converse with me. Later at night, I brought it to Gerard's attention that this atmosphere of a putsch, played out in front of the foreigners, seemed to me very unfortunate, that we should either break off or come to an agreement, and that a new meeting was appointed for tomorrow. On June 3, at 10 o'clock, the whole 7 assembled. This time General Guy Raud moderated his persistence. I brought the text of the decision and the declaration establishing the new committee. The drafts were fully accepted. We declared, de Gaulle and General Giraud jointly decide to establish the French Committee of National Liberation. Both of us became its chairman. Catroux, George, Massigli, Monet, and Philippe became the first members of the committee. Others would soon be appointed. We declared the committee is the central French authority. It directs the French military effort in all its forms and everywhere. It exercises French sovereignty. It provides leadership for all French interests and their defence throughout the world. It assumes authority over all territories and all military forces under either the French National Committee or the civil and military commander-in-chief. We added, pending the moment when the committee may transfer its powers to the future provisional government of the Republic. It undertakes to restore all French liberties, the laws of the Republic and the Republican regime, and to completely destroy the regime of arbitrary and personal power now imposed on the country. At the same time, the question of the proconsuls was settled. We decided to accept Pérotin's resignation and to appoint General Catroux Governor-General of Algiers, with him remaining on the committee. General Nogues, we decided, should leave Morocco. Besson would be recalled from Dakar by the new head of the Ministry of Colonies. General Berguet was retiring. In spite of its obvious shortcomings, the body thus constituted was nevertheless, in my opinion, a perfectly acceptable starting point. Undoubtedly, the ridiculous dualism in its leadership will have to be tolerated for the time being. It must certainly be foreseen that the Allied policy, to be pursued in the committee by persons imposed upon us, will give rise to a series of acute incidents, until the Commander-in-Chief in North Africa is in fact subordinated to the central authority, as he has already been subordinated to it according to our text. But the French Committee of National Liberation was in accordance with those principles for which fighting France had invariably fought. As to their realization, that duty rested with me. Viewing the committee in the light of the responsibility entrusted to it, I realized that, as it evolved internally under the pressure of public opinion, it would rally more closely around me and help me to weed out all unstable and centrifugal elements. For the time being, the certain duality which we had adopted at the beginning still enabled me, for all its inconveniences, to influence the military and administrative elements in North Africa, which had hitherto been outside my sphere of influence. As for those who in France and elsewhere had placed their trust in me, I was sure that they would still wish to follow me alone. As I closed the meeting, I felt that I had taken a major step towards unity. That is why, forgetting everything, all the painful vicissitudes, I embraced General Giraud with all my heart. But if I myself was satisfied, the Allies felt in complete satisfaction. The establishment of a central French authority in North Africa, which took over the functions of the government, proclaimed French sovereignty and expelled the proconsuls, was in flagrant contradiction to the position taken by Roosevelt and his ministers. That is why the declaration published at noon on June 3 by the French Committee of National Liberation, announcing its emergence into the world, was kept under wraps by the American censor until 9 o'clock in the evening. For my part, I hastened to bring the press representatives up to speed, knowing that this would help to sweep away the censorial obstacles sooner or later. The next day, speaking on the radio, where a group of Gauls had infiltrated, I announced to the French of France that their government was henceforth operating in Algeria, awaiting the hour when it could appear in Paris. On June 6, a meeting of the Fighting French, attended by thousands of people, gave me, as well as Philip and the captain, an occasion to show the audience clearly the tone and style in which our official speeches would henceforth be held. Needless to say, the American and British missions were not very anxious to see our speeches spread over the world. The bad spirit of the Allies was not, however, confined to the field of information. Thus, having sent a telegram to London to summon urgently my colleagues whom I wanted to bring into the government, I waited for 10 days in vain. On various pretexts, the English tried to delay their departure. In Algiers itself, however, the English government, whether on its own initiative or not, did not look favourably upon our activities. As soon as we landed in Boufarik on May 30, as I immediately learned that Churchill and soon Eden secretly arrived in Algeria. Churchill had settled in a secluded villa, receiving confidential information on the progress of our disputes through General Georges. But when the French committee was organised, the Prime Minister made himself known by inviting me and Gerard, as well as the commissioners, to a so-called country dinner on June 6. Only respect for the Prime Minister's person prevented me from declining this invitation. When I remarked to Churchill that we were somewhat surprised at his presence here in these days and under these circumstances, he declared that he had not even attempted to interfere in French affairs. However, he added, the military situation obliges the English government to know what is going on in that important zone of communications, which is North Africa. And we would take our measures if there were any sudden shake-up. Say, if you were to swallow the Girard, which was not my intention at all. Yes, I was determined to make the French government a real government, but I intended to proceed gradually, step by step, and not out of fear of foreigners, but for reasons of national interest. I hoped that I could induce General Girard to respect the general interest. Although he was too slow, I had always hoped to make him play the first part in the military sphere, provided he confined himself to that field and received his post from the French authorities. In truth, he could not have been a real commander-in-chief, and I regretted it more than anyone. But what can one do? Allied strategy envisioned only two really conceivable theatres in the West, the Northern and the Mediterranean, and we, alas, were not able to put a sufficient number of land, sea and air forces, and could not therefore demand that the French general was on one of these fronts commander-in-chief in the literal sense of the word. We had enough men, of course. If we wished, we could have recruited among the brave and loyal French population, but our available cadre of officers and military specialists severely limited the number of our formations. Besides, it was not in our power to arm and equip them. Compared to the forces that will be put up for real military action in Italy and France, each of the two Allied powers, our forces could not play a superior role. In particular, our ground forces would for a long time amount to no more than an army group at best. There was therefore no hope that the Americans and British, whether in the north or the south, would agree to entrust the French commander with the overall direction of operations. Undoubtedly, things could have been different if in June 1940, the legally empowered government of the Republic, together with the central administration, together with diplomacy, at the head of 500,000 men who would have filled the assembly points, would have moved to North Africa, together with the combat units that could be transported by sea, with all its military and merchant fleet, with the crews of fighter aircraft, with the crews of bombers. The latter, however, did arrive here, but they were forced back to give the airplanes to the invader. The gold reserve and credit that France had at that time was enough to purchase in America abundant equipment in anticipation of Lend-Lease. With these funds, as well as those already in Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia and in the Middle East, in North Africa could again form an impressive military fist under the protection of the sea and under the cover of French and British squadrons, in particular hundreds of submarines. Thus, the Allies who, at our request and a whole year earlier, would have positioned themselves with us at our initial bases in French North Africa, would then quite naturally recognize in this theatre of war the supreme authority of a French general or admiral. But the terrible panic and then ruinous decomposition resulted in the fact that the means still at our disposal were not transferred to Africa, and most of the military personnel there were given to the enemy or demobilized. The civil authorities and military commanders were given over to the mercy of the enemy, and orders were given to meet the Allies with gun salvos. All this deprived France of her most important chance in advance, as indeed it did many others. Never have I felt more bitter sadness than at the thought of all this. But if General Girard's experience and ability could not be fully displayed in the course of military operations, he was still quite capable of rendering us great service. For this purpose he should, after relinquishing the post of President of the Government, have acted as a member of it as Minister of the Armed Forces, or, as he was disinclined to play an administrative role, he should have become Inspector General of our forces, and at the same time military advisor to the Committee, and represented it at the Inter-Allied Command. I must say that while I had no objection to the first solution, I felt that the second was more suitable for him. Several times I offered General Girard both of these posts to choose from, but he would not voluntarily choose either. His illusions, the influence of a certain environment and certain interests, the influence of the Allies, all these combined to induce him to insist on his desire still to dispose of the army personally and completely. And the fact that ordinances and decrees went behind our two signatures enabled him to prevent the authorities from doing anything without his consent. It was therefore inevitable that Giraud should find himself alone and in the background, and in the end confined by a framework which he was unwilling to recognize, and, on the other hand, deprived of the outside support which was the cause of his giddiness, he resolved to leave. As for me, it was not without regret that I had to engage in this burdensome affair, too painfully affecting this great soldier for whom I had always had respect and appreciation. On the road that led to the unity of the fatherland, I have more than once encountered personal problems when feelings fail to cope with the demands of duty, and duty does not reckon with their vulnerability. But I can say that I have never had to apply the iron law of national interest so dearly. I have, however, been able to accomplish this only gradually. On June 5, the Committee of 7 met again. This time it was a question of electing the remaining members and dividing up the functions. Georges was appointed State Commissioner, while Catrou retained the same title given to him earlier. Massigli and Philip were left in charge of the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, the one for Foreign Affairs and the other for Domestic Affairs, which they had previously been in charge of. Monet was given the responsibility of arming and supplying. At the suggestion of General Giraud, the committee was composed of Cuve de Merville, Commissariat of Finance, Rien Meyer, Commissariat of Transportation and Public Works, and Abadai, Commissariat of Justice, Education and Health. I put Pleven there as Commissary of Colonies, Dytherm as Commissary of National Economy, Tixier of Labour, and Bonnet of Information. In addition, we appointed ambassadors to Morocco, Puo, and to the Middle East, Elio, and confirmed General Mast in his post in Tunisia. These appointments reassured me. In Algeria, Rabat, Tunisia, as was already the case in Beirut, Brazzaville, Douala, Tanarive, Noumea, power would be exercised by men who supported our participation in the war and on whom I could count. At Dakar, in 2 weeks' time, Bosson would be succeeded by Conari, who had been transferred there from Cameroon. In Fort-de-France, everything indicated that order would soon be established there as well. As for the government itself, it was composed of sensible and honourable men, most of whom had long been loyal to me and others, with few exceptions, who wished to prove the same. Knowing firmly that the majority were ready to support me, I decided to begin the second round of the game. But before I rolled the dice, I gave them a good shake. On June 8, the committee, numbering only 7 members, while waiting for the others still in London, put the knotty question of command up for discussion. There were 3 drafts before us. The first project, put forward by Georges, envisaged the unification of all French forces under the authority of Giraud, acting both as minister and commander-in-chief, and retaining in addition his functions as chairman, but in the military field independent of the French government. The second project, put forward by Catrou was to entrust de Gaulle directly with the Department of National Defence, and Giraud with the command of the troops. The third, my project, entrusted the commander-in-chief with the mission to instruct all French forces and to cooperate with the Allied military commanders in determining the plan of general operations. As soon as possible, he would assume command on the battlefield and thus cease to be a member of the government. According to my plan, the organisation and distribution of forces were to be determined by a military committee consisting of de Gaulle and Giraud, the respective ministers and chiefs of staff, with the proviso that, if necessary, the government would have the final say. A majority of the council rejected the first draft. Giraud, supported by Georges, did not accept the other 2. Since the majority of the members had not yet decided to force the commander to agree or withdraw, it had to be recognized that it was impossible to bring the matter to a conclusion. But then why was the whole committee necessary? This was the question I put in writing to its members, concluding that for 8 days we had not even begun to resolve the question of the powers of the government and the military command, the logical solution of which, in the interests of the nation, was self-evident, and that the most insignificant question, which could be solved and exhausted in a few moments, was causing us endless and unpleasant discussions. I declared that I could no longer participate in the work of the committee under the circumstances. Thereupon, dejected by all that was going on, I retired to the Villa Glikinia and made it clear to the ministers, officials and generals who came to see me that I was going to leave for Brazzaville. The impression made by this decisive rupture hastened the course of events. General Girard suddenly summoned the committee to a meeting which I did not attend, but the members of the committee told him that they could not, under such circumstances, make any sensible judgment. On the other hand, the disadvantages of the dual power caused a flood of sarcasm abroad and created anxiety and irritation among all Frenchmen. The army was also affected. General Juin, who had arrived in Algiers, informed me of it and entreated the Giraud to give up his pretensions. General Busquet, chief of the General Staff of the Air Force, acted in the same direction. Disturbing rumours were growing in the Governor-General's office, at the university, and in the editorial offices of the newspapers. After 6 days of general confusion, I decided that the matter was overdue. Incidentally, the commissioners, whom until lately London had kept out, had just arrived in Algiers. The government could thus sit in full session, and I expected to find in the majority a stronger support than that given me by the 7. So I took the initiative of convening a committee of 14 to try in turn to settle the question which was interfering with the government. The meeting was held, but in the presence of his colleagues, Giraud strongly protested against the very raising of the question, because he did not wish to recognize the competence of the committee, although it had been established by the decree to which the commander-in-chief himself had subscribed. Thus, even in the last act of this unhappy vaudeville, which enabled the Vichy clique and the interfering foreigners to humiliate France for 7 months, Giraud persisted in his desire to play the role of President of the Council of Ministers, which does not recognize the government. It is true that the Allies did not much lament this circumstance. Seeing what the matter was coming to, they made a fresh attempt to prevent France from having a government. But their very intervention was precisely what shook the Girards' position. On June 16, Murphy and Macmillan handed Massaglie for transmission to the French Committee of National Liberation a message from General Eisenhower, who asked Generals de Gaulle and Giraud to visit him to talk concerning the problems of command and organization of the French armed forces. The conversation took place on June 19. There were 3 interlocutors, and another silent witness, General Bedell Smith, was present. Murphy and Macmillan, as well as most American and British officials and military men, kept close by, attentive and boisterous. I deliberately came last and asked for the floor first. "I am here," I said to Eisenhower, "in my capacity as President of the French government. It is customary that in operations the heads of state and government personally visit the general staff of the officer to whom they have entrusted the command of the armies. If it pleases you to address me with a request concerning your field of activity, know that I am prepared in advance to meet it. It goes without saying, provided it is compatible with the interests I am called upon to defend." The Commander-in-Chief of the Allied armies, endeavouring to maintain civility, stated as follows. "I am preparing a very important operation which will shortly unfold in Italy, and which is directly connected with the liberation of Europe and France. In order to secure the logistics of this operation, I need an assurance from you, which I ask you to give. The existing organization of the French command in North Africa must not undergo any change. In particular, General Giraud must remain in place, perform all his functions, and retain entirely at his disposal troops, communications, ports, and airfields. He is to negotiate with me alone all military matters in North Africa. Although it is not my business to deal with your internal organization, which concerns you alone, these points are very essential to us. I say this to you in the name of the American and British governments, who are supplying arms to the French troops and who will not be able to continue the supply unless the conditions I have mentioned are fulfilled. I take note of your démarche," I replied. "You ask of me an assurance which I will not give you. For the organization of the French command is the business of the French government, and by no means yours. But after listening to you, I want to ask you a few questions. All nations at war, such as America, entrust generals with the command of troops and entrust ministers with the care of organizing them. Do you think it possible to forbid the French government to do the same?" General Eisenhower confined himself to saying that the request was due to a desire to preserve entirely the prerogatives of the Giraud. "You refer," I said, "to your responsibility as Commander-in-Chief in the face of the American and British governments. But do you know that I, too, have my responsibilities to France, and that by virtue of those responsibilities I cannot accept the interference of any foreign power in the functions of the French authorities. Eisenhower remained silent. I continue. Here you are a man of war. Can you really believe that a leader is capable of maintaining his authority if it is based on the favor of some foreign power? After a new and grave silence, the American commander-in-chief said to me, I perfectly understand, General, that you are concerned with the more distant destinies of your country. But please understand that I am personally weighed down by today's military concern. So am I. I answered him, for my government is hastily carrying out the unification of the various French forces. Those of fighting France, those of North Africa, those now being formed in the metropolis, in short, all those whom the present system compels to be kept apart. Our government must arm these forces, taking advantage of the means you provide us in the interests of our alliance and in return for the many services we render you. In this regard, I too wish to put a question to you. Do you remember that, during the last war, France played the same role in supplying arms to a number of countries as the United States does today? We, the French, fully armed the Belgians and the Serbs, supplied equipment to the Russians and the Romanians, and finally, to a large extent, technically equipped your army. Yes, during the First World War you Americans fired guns, but our guns used tanks, but our tanks flew airplanes, but our airplanes. And did we demand in return from Belgium, Serbia, Russia, Romania? Did we demand from the United States the appointment of this or that leader or the establishment of this or that particular political system? Again, there was silence. General Giraud, who had kept his mouth shut from the beginning of the conversation, suddenly said, I, too, have a responsibility to the army. This army is small. It can only exist within the Allied armies. This is true both with regard to the command and organization of the army and its operations. At this I rose, left the room and retired to my villa. The next day, at my request, the General Staff of the Allies handed me, as well as Giraud, written note clarifying the requirements of the British and Americans in the part concerning the subordination of the French army. I wanted a material trace to be left of these demands. After enumerating General Giraud's functions, the note ended with the following phrase. The Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces draws attention to the assurances given by the American and British governments that they guarantee the respect and protection of French sovereignty in French North and West Africa. Although this stylistic figure, which sounded a very ironic conclusion to the demands themselves and contradicted them, should have been attributed to the Allied Commander-in-Chief, I recognized in it the old favorite movie Washington and London. On the one hand, bowing to our rights, and on the other violating them, but I knew that such a course of action, quite in keeping with the policy pursued toward France by the American and British governments, had not been adopted on the initiative of General Eisenhower, and was not at all in keeping with his character. He was a soldier. Every action seemed to him direct and simple, and this was suggested to him by his nature and profession. To put in motion, following the rules consecrated by tradition, certain habitual means, that was how he saw war, and therefore his entering into it at a difficult hour. Eisenhower acted as a man who for 35 years has learned certain principles of technique and philosophy, and he was not at all inclined to revise them. And then, quite unexpectedly, he was assigned a role of exceptional complexity. Torn out of the tight confines of the then American army, he becomes Commander-in-Chief of the troops of the giant coalition, owing to the fact that he had had to lead the forces of many nations in the battles on which the destinies of their states depended. He could now see how, breaking through the familiar system of the armies subordinate to him, come out the pinched national feelings and ambitions. It was fortunate for the Allies that Dwight Eisenhower was not only able to find in himself the caution necessary to deal with these agonizing problems, but was also able to see the broad horizons that history had opened before him as a military leader. He knew how to be nimble and flexible. But he was not only skillful, he knew how to be bold, and it was indeed required of him to throw on the coast of Africa army, transported from one side of the ocean to the other to enter Italy, where the enemy had fresh forces, to land tank units on a narrow strip of the Normandy coast and face a well-fortified and skillfully acting enemy, to throw in the gap in a ranch mechanized army pattern and reach Metz. In doing this, he mastered the position chiefly by system and perseverance, choosing intelligent plans, to which he persevered, giving great importance also to rear area service, General Eisenhower led to victory the complex and spirited machine of the armies of the free world. It will never be forgotten that in this capacity he had the honor of leading them to the liberation of France. But as the magnitude of the demands of a great nation are in proportion to its troubles, it will probably be said also that the Commander-in-Chief could have served our country better. Had he, in determining his strategy, taken the side of France as he adapted his strategy to the plans of the Anglo-Saxon countries, had he fully equipped our units, including the secret army, had he in his plans invariably laid the primary mission on the shoulders of the reviving French army, we might have recovered our military power with greater brilliancy, and a clearer future would have opened before us. In conversing with him, I often had the feeling that this man of magnanimous heart was really inclined to such decisions. But before my eyes he was again, as if reluctantly, abandoning them. Indeed, the policy of Washington determined his line and enjoined restraint. He accepted it, being subordinate to Roosevelt's authority, and because he listened to the advisers assigned to him by the president, and because his every move was watched by his colleagues, his rivals, and he himself had not yet acquired in his relations with authority the confidence which a military commander is eventually assured by major services rendered. If, however, he sometimes tolerated tendencies that led to our ousting under one or another plausible pretext, I can assure you that he did not do so out of conviction. He even, as I myself am a witness, accepted my direct interference in his strategic plans whenever I had the national interest at heart. In fact, this great soldier had that mysterious attraction which for 2 centuries had brought our countries together in the great dramas of the world. It was not his fault that this time the United States listened not so much to the voice of our troubles as to the desire to dominate. In any case, Eisenhower's political démarche of June 19, directed from above, produced an impression opposite to that which Washington had hoped for. The Committee of National Liberation, having learned on June 21 of the British and American demands, decided, at my suggestion, to leave them unanswered. But the offended members of the committee brought it to Girard's attention that he must make a final choice, either to submit to the French government or to withdraw and resign his office. Moreover, as Girard had alluded to the inconvenience, from the point of view of military secrecy, of having military matters dealt with by an areopagus of 14 ministers, it was decided, as I had suggested, to organize a military committee under my chairmanship consisting of the Commander-in-Chief, the Chiefs of Staff, and representatives of the government. The committee was to decide questions of organization, recruitment, and unification of our forces, as well as their deployment in the various theaters of war and in the various territories. 2 commanders temporarily exercised authority. Girard was still in charge of the North African forces, de Gaulle was in charge of all others, including the secret army. But the fundamental decisions remained with the Committee of National Liberation, now sitting in full session. This compromise did not suit me at all. I wanted another step on the path of common sense, namely, that the unity of leadership in the government itself should be established once and for all, that the functions of General Girard should be clearly defined, that 1 or more ministers should take charge of the armies, as well as the exercise of military power outside the zone of operations, so that the merger of the French forces of North Africa with those of fighting France might at last be realized on that basis. But the committee, though it saw the ultimate goal, was not yet sufficiently determined to go to it quickly. In addition, General Girard told us that he had received an invitation from President Roosevelt to come to Washington to discuss questions concerning military supplies. The Commander-in-Chief insisted that the questions of committee structure and command be postponed until his return. Most of the ministers were inclined to delay, and I, though applied to these transitory decisions, had a very definite intention of putting all the figures in their proper places at the earliest possible moment. Girard departed on July 2. His trip was undertaken by agreement between the American government and Girard himself without consultation with the Committee of National Liberation, irrespective of the practical purpose of his trip, namely, to negotiate the supply of arms for our troops. Girard's visit was regarded in the United States as an appropriate occasion to demonstrate their policy toward France, to confirm that, in discussing military affairs with one of our leaders, they refused to regard us as a government and wished openly to support a French general whom they had long since chosen for operations in North Africa. All this was done in order to strengthen his position in the eyes of American public opinion. Churchill felt obliged to support President Roosevelt, addressing British representatives abroad and to the editors of British newspapers with a memorandum which outlined the claims of the Prime Minister to General de Gaulle. Needless to say, despite the offensive nature of the memorandum, it was published in American newspapers. In spite of all these efforts, however, the result of the trip did not live up to its hopes. For the President and his ministers deliberately accepted Giraud only as a military figure, and since he himself had no desire to do otherwise, American public opinion showed little interest in his arrival. The business part of the negotiations, which consisted in equipping a few French divisions, could not inspire the public, and it was felt that it would not at all recognize as a champion of the French cause the humble guest so extolled by the newspapers of the country. As for well-informed circles, they disliked the subordinate position which General Giraud had taken, and the insistence of the White House on using Giraud's presence to publicize a policy of which many disapproved. The same applies to Giraud's statement to the Washington reporters, since it became known that our general had made it known to the United States government in advance and had even changed the text of his statement a minute before the press conference began. The same applies to Roosevelt's behavior in connection with this visit, which, as the President said on July 10, was only the visit of a French soldier fighting for the Allied cause, since at this moment France no longer exists. The same applies to the White House dinner, which was attended only by the military and to which the French ambassador Henry Oppenau, the accredited representative of the Committee of National Liberation, was not even invited. The same can be said of the speeches exchanged that evening between Giraud and the President, in which not even a hint was made of the Algerian government, nor of the unity, integrity, and independence of France. And finally, what caused discontent was what happened on July 14, the day of the French National. General Giraud received neither congratulations nor messages from the government of which he was a guest, nor did he himself address it, confining himself to boarding the battleship Richelieu in the morning and attending a reception given by the French colony at a New York hotel in the evening.